No corners have been cut. All the same regulatory environments in place. In fact, the bar went up from a regulatory standpoint. The FDA asked for more people to be involved in the clinical studies than a flu vaccine would typically be tested in. So really, the urgency came from the pandemic and by creating these more streamlined processes, not by changing the rules. And I think that's something that, your listeners and viewers are really going to want to understand. The rules weren't changed. If anything, like I said, they were a little bit more stringent.
Welcome to the 9th episode of NewsPoints on the Air, a production of the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists. I'm your host, Milan Medley. We're taking some time to discuss the COVID-19 vaccines with Dr. Stephen Smith, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer of AdventHealth. AdventHealth is one of 5 Adventist healthcare institutions within the North American Division territory, and it is also one of the largest healthcare networks in the United States, with 80,000 employees operating on nearly 50 hospital campuses in 9 states. In his role, Dr. Stephen Smith guides the research vision and scientific expansion for AdventHealth. He is also the scientific director for the Translational Research Institute for Metabolism and Diabetes, and that is dedicated to the study of obesity, metabolism, diabetes, and the metabolic origins of cardiovascular disease. I'm delighted to have him here to walk us through Vaccine Development 101 and also the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines and whether they should be trusted. Spoiler alert, yes, they should definitely be trusted. Dr. Smith, can you describe the role of a chief scientific officer in a large hospital network? What are your day-to-day what do your days look like and what do your weeks look like?
Yeah, so I split my time in really 3 different areas. First off, we have a very large research enterprise across the company. We have about 250 or more employees, about 250 physicians that do research within AdventHealth. And that's a big research engine that does the clinical trials and the different studies. And that takes about 1/3 of my time. There's a lot to keep up with that. The other 1/3 is really advising the company on different matters of science. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes when it comes to how we reviewed the science around the vaccines here in North America. And that's one of many components where we're asked to conduct scientific review to advise the company, to advise different service lines and that sort of thing. The third part is really more strategic. It's how we look over the horizon. What are the new technologies, the new advances in biomedical sciences that are ready to come into the company? And many times our physicians out on the front lines are evaluating different new surgical procedures or different medications that are in development, or big data views of how we think about taking care of our patients. So these are new advancements that we're constantly out as a group scanning to try to see when are they ready to bring into the organization. So those are kind of the 3 big areas. I would say in the last year, it's been all COVID all the time, starting about 10, 11 months ago. And so the team has really coalesced around that. And we've started actually new lines of research in the last year. One in particular is our critical care research unit here in Orlando that is investigating new treatments, new medications, new approaches to take care of our sickest patients in our ICUs and in our hospitals. And so there's always something new. It never stands still. We keep new innovation coming into the hospital and into our care facilities, and that's really my job, is to make sure that we serve as a catalyst to get those ideas into the organization. And oftentimes, a research protocol where we invite people to volunteer is the first introduction of a technology or a medication or a new surgical procedure into the healthcare setting. And then that next step is to get it out, across all of our hospitals and clinics. And that's what our clinical colleagues do.
That's fascinating. And like you said, it's been COVID-19 has taken up a majority of your time. But briefly, before it was COVID-19, in terms kind of like driving the research needs, just briefly, can you like maybe list some of the other things, exciting topics or, procedures and all that you and your team were looking into prior to this worldwide pandemic?
Yeah, so a couple of areas are really advancing quickly right now. Cancer therapy is really an area that we've been investing quite substantially in. And we know that every person who has cancer has a different kind of cancer. And we're using what's called precision medicine. It's using the genomics of a particular person's tumor to tailor therapies against their cancer. And that lock and key really can radically change how people respond to the treatments that we have. And so that area, that whole space of using genomics to advance our cancer therapeutics is a big deal for us. We're also working on a large research partnership with colleagues at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa. That was established about 1.5 years ago. And so we're really amping up our cancer research program, not only clinical studies, but getting at more basic science, more fundamental understanding of how cancer develops and how we can treat that most effectively. So that's been a big push for us before the pandemic. And actually during the pandemic, we've continued that work because, cancer doesn't take a retreat when you have a pandemic around you. And so we've continued to push on that really hard. The other areas I think that we continue to develop is in the area of cardiovascular diseases. We know so much about how to both diagnose and treat cardiovascular diseases, and we continue to refine those life-saving treatments, not only new pacemakers or new interventions, but also new prevention, new ways of preventing the development of cardiovascular disease. So that research unit has been driving very far and fast in the last year, actually. We continue to work in Alzheimer's, in really trying to understand, are there new breakthrough treatments for Alzheimer's, which has been a real challenge in the larger field in the last year. So we're pushing on brain health, neurosciences, and being able to develop those areas well. We're an aging population here in the United States, right? I mean, we're graying as a population, and so we really need to get ahead of that. So that's been another big push for us.
Wow. And I'm glad you took the time to describe that, because as you said, COVID-19 may be, what a lot of people are talking about, but people they still have cancer, they still have heart disease. Many people have loved ones who have Alzheimer's. So it's great to know that there is still a robust system addressing those health conditions as well.
Absolutely. And, we have to take care of the urgent, but I think one of our responsibilities as, one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States is to look over the horizon and say, okay, what do we need to be prepared for next? I mentioned a few of these. Heart disease continues, cancer continues. With the graying of the American population, Alzheimer's is going to be, a huge problem in many years. So we need to get ahead of these. And again, that's that third part I was talking about a minute ago. We need to look over the horizon, map out what we can, and try to really get ahead of those.
Yeah. Speaking of getting ahead, we can talk about, moving forward with vaccination as it relates to COVID-19. So most people who will be watching this or listening have heard something about the COVID-19 vaccines that are available. So, but can we first do kind of like a vaccination 101, kind of get to the nuts and bolts? How does a vaccine get developed? What is that process? Timeline, just someone who
Sure.
knows nothing about how vaccines are created. What is that process?
Well, let's start with kind of the traditional way that one makes a vaccine, okay?
Hmm.
And this is 2021 now. Technology, particularly genomic science, has advanced radically fast over the last several years, just like computers have advanced almost in parallel with the speed of the advancement. But the old way of making a vaccine was you took and isolated a particular virus, you killed it, you ground it up, and you gave a shot. Okay, really, that was the old polio vaccine. The
Okay.
first polio vaccines, basically, that's what they did. And that development process was really quite long. It took a long time to figure out how to isolate the virus, how to kill it effectively, how to, put it into a shot, scale that up. I mean, it was really complicated. And vaccines can take, just to develop the first one, can take somewhere between, 5 to 10 years to get a good vaccine. It took us about, for example, when Ebola broke out in Africa, and we had those cases here in the United States, it took about 3.5 or 4 years to get the first Ebola vaccine that was ready to even test. So that's kind of the old way, the old technology of developing vaccines, and it's quite slow and laborious, and that's all changed. So the newer technologies are based upon genomics. We now know, we knew actually this time a year ago, in January of last year, we had the first genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And that sequence was published, and immediately people in several different companies started to develop vaccines for that particular virus. And that was based upon work with earlier versions, if you will, the SARS and MERS. You may have heard about those several years ago. That's why this is called SARS-CoV-2, because there was CoV-1, which was MERS, and then now we have SARS-CoV-2. But those companies, the pharmaceutical companies, began to very quickly, based upon the the RNA sequence of the coronavirus, they started to work on vaccines. And that really gave us a head start. We started early, and then B, we used these new technologies to develop vaccines in a faster and more efficient way. So let me talk for a minute about how these new vaccines are developed compared to the old way, which I mentioned a minute ago. So there are three main different kinds of vaccines that are being developed. So the first two out, we've all heard of them. It's the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And those are using a technology that's about 10 years old and had been in clinical studies already, not for SARS, but or coronavirus, but for other purposes. And those actually use a little tiny snippet of nucleic acid, so-called RNA. So in the body, DNA, everybody knows about DNA. DNA gets copied into RNA, and then that RNA gets turned into a protein. All the proteins in our body are made through that process. And these two companies, the one that was collaboratively worked on with Pfizer is called BioNTech, and then the other one is Moderna. That's the other vaccine. They use a little snippet of this genetic code, and it's made in a big test tube, basically, in big vats. And it specifically allows, once it is shot into the body, it allows the body to make the protein, just one little snippet of that coronavirus. And what that does, it tricks the immune system into thinking the whole body is infected. And that's how the immune system responds. Antibodies are developed. Little lymphocytes, white blood cells in the body called T cells and B cells get a little bit angry. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
Those T cells and B cells get a little bit angry, because they think they're fighting a real virus, but instead of the whole virus, it's just one little tiny snippet of the virus, a little protein called the spike protein that the immune system is responding to. The body makes those antibodies. It teaches those T cells and B cells, these white blood cells, to fight off the real coronavirus when the body is exposed to it. So that method, this mRNA method, is very fast. We'll talk about safety in just a few minutes. They have both had outstanding safety profiles. And this is the new way. This is how you can do this in such a short period of time, is that DNA-based technology is like computers, okay? We remember the big box computer that was slow. That's like the old TV sets that you may have had when you're my age and you were growing up that were this big before we had everything else. This technology has really developed at a pace that is going to change how we think about making vaccines for everything into the future.
Wow.
And think about this, Moderna, the company that makes this particular, the second vaccine that was approved, is working on a flu vaccine that you maybe don't have to take but once or twice in your life. Okay?
Whoa.
Yeah. So, and there will be other vaccines based upon these technologies, not only for future threats like COVID-19, but for the standard things that we already get. So it's a fantastic technology. Now there are two other technologies. There's a technology that has been used to fight Ebola. There's an FDA-approved Ebola vaccine. Didn't know that, but if Ebola ever comes to the United States, we have a vaccine for that. That technology is based on basically engineering a little virus like we get with the common cold and putting that little protein, the spike protein, on the outside. And that technology is being used by AstraZeneca. This was recently approved in the United Kingdom, in the UK. Is approved for treating or preventing COVID-19. And then there's another company called Janssen, which is part of Johnson & Johnson. We all know baby powder, right? So Johnson & Johnson has another similar kind of vaccine that's in development right now, and we're testing that here in Orlando at AdventHealth. And these vaccines are going to be the vaccines, I believe, that are going to be necessary to wipe out COVID-19 across the globe. And the reason is you don't have to keep them cold. They're very inexpensive to make, pennies to make these kinds of vaccines. And that's what it's going to take, is to actually vaccinate the entire planet. So we don't have, like we were chasing polio. Everybody remembers we worried about polio when we were kids. We wiped out polio because we were able to vaccinate the entire planet. So those are the two major kinds of vaccines. And then we have some more traditional vaccines that are made, like a flu vaccine. And those take longer to develop. And so those vaccines are probably, those more traditional vaccines are not going to be ready until probably the fall. Could be even later in the year as those traditional vaccines. So the new technologies have allowed us to move faster and allowed us to start fighting the pandemic much sooner than we would have otherwise.
So where would you say the narrative of, so I remember maybe it was in the fall or late fall, there was talk of, okay, there's going to be a vaccine by the end of the year. And there was a sort of panic because it's like, oh, this is too soon. So like, where do you think, because that was, at least in my circles and online, people were saying this is way too soon. Where did that come from? Because you're saying like, you know, it would seem like a natural next step in the process in your side of the world, you know, and with your insight and just understanding how these developments work. But when did that disconnect happen?
Yeah, well, a couple things happened. The first one is that this RNA technology that we were talking about has been in development for more than a decade. So it was just not seen. We didn't see it because we didn't have a pandemic or a crisis to really wake us up and go, okay, how are vaccines made? A year ago, was anybody talking about how vaccines are made and how long it takes to develop them? We were just kind of like, okay, whatever. But the pandemic really allowed us to take that decade-long work and put it into action very quickly.
Wow.
Now, the second thing that happened that I think is important for your viewers and listeners is that the typical way of making a vaccine is you make a little bit, you test it in a few people, you make a little bit more, you test it in some more people, and then eventually, over years, you get to the answer. Now, one thing that happened is there was this investment by the federal government, Operation Warp Speed. We've all heard about it. And what happened was they ran those in parallel. So there was a little bit of testing, but they made all the doses of the vaccine that would be needed. So you didn't have this, and then that, and then this, and then that. You ran it all at once. So that really accelerated the pace.
Okay.
Now, the reason that has never happened in the past is we never had a pandemic to really push us to do it that way, where you run these things side by side. And I think that kind of got lost in the message of, oh, this is getting rushed, okay, and that's that. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that the rules that the FDA puts in place for how one develops vaccines, none of those were changed or broken. Nobody broke rules to make it work this fast. Companies had been going slow because they're used to going slow. They didn't have a pandemic to really push things forward. But I can tell you this, and I've seen this from the inside as we've worked on this vaccine trial that I told you about a minute ago with Janssen. No corners have been cut. All the same regulatory environments in place. In fact, the bar went up from a regulatory standpoint. The FDA asked for more people to be involved in the clinical studies than a flu vaccine would typically be tested in. So really, the urgency came from the pandemic and by creating these more streamlined processes, not by changing the rules. And I think that's something that, you know, your listeners and viewers are really going to want to understand. The rules weren't changed. If anything, like I said, they were a little bit more stringent. It's just that we had this urgency and the need to develop these vaccines more quickly.
Yeah, it sounds like supply and demand, you know, at the end of the day.
Exactly. Exactly.
You know?
And I think the demand's pretty high.
Yeah, I would
across the
say.
globe. You know, I think we feel some pressure. And, you know, as being, I'm the principal investigator of this trial with Janssen here in Orlando. We had a fantastic response from our community, people who volunteered to participate in the research study, not only for themselves, because they felt that urgency of being able to do something to help, you know, their neighbor, their friends, their parents, you know, the whole world, in fact. And people showed up, they raised their hand and they said, we understand there's some uncertainty, but they wanted to participate in the clinical studies. And that was true across the globe.
Yeah.
People stepped up and you know, you don't participate in these kinds of studies because we give you a check for $20 to help pay for your gas. You know, I mean, you have to have a real commitment to doing something that's good for the world, for your community, for your family to participate. And so these trials enrolled in record time. I mean, people showed up, they signed up, they went through the whole standard process. And so I think the other thing that accelerated that was just the willingness of people to participate in the clinical studies.
Wow. So it's combination of, you know, the technology had already been developed, the process was already there, and then alongside that, you had a sense of community, global realization of community to step up. So with those two things, boom, we have a
Boom.
vaccine.
And I think that second piece is something that people haven't really talked about. I mean, you know, the human nature is oftentimes to gravitate towards the negative or what can go wrong. But there's so much that's gone right around the development of these new vaccines that that I think we can be, you know, proud of people and really appreciate what people have done to step up and work double time and push a little bit harder and to respond to this from a community standpoint. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, that is incredible. And you're right, that's the side we don't often hear about. But I was wondering if you could, because I'm sure you've been in these situations, if you, um, someone plainly comes up to you and says, how can I trust the Pfizer? How can I trust the Moderna vaccines?
Yeah.
Like in an elevator pitch. What's your elevator pitch for, or in response to, how can I know the vaccines can be trusted?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Let me just say the elevator pitch is, we formed a scientific review committee here at AdventHealth that went through all of the data. There's beautiful data transparency. You can go out and look at all the results from those 2 clinical trials. You can see how many people's arms hurt, how many people got tired, how many headaches there were.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
it's all sitting there.
Mhm.
And you can go to FDA.gov and read for yourself. But we formed a scientific review panel to take a second look at that data, in addition to the experts at FDA and those who advise the FDA on that. So my elevator pitch is, I've seen all the data, and it's quite compelling. And I use what I call my, kind of mother, brother, neighbor rule. And that is this something I'd recommend to my mother or my brother or a neighbor as a physician? That's just a perspective that I often take in addition to the data. But I, without a doubt, would recommend these 2 vaccines for my mother, my brother, or my neighbor. The safety profile is outstanding. And with regards to the efficacy, does it work? Can it prevent COVID? The flu vaccine, depending on the year, is probably about 70% effective or something like that. These are 95% effective at preventing a symptomatic case of COVID. And both of these vaccines were shown to be 100% effective at keeping people out of the hospital with COVID. So even the 1 in 20 people who developed a case of COVID, it was mild and didn't cause them to go into the hospital. So you couldn't design a vaccine that looked any better than these first 2 vaccines that are out of the gate. And I think that extra review has given confidence not only to our leaders at AdventHealth, but to our physicians at AdventHealth, who are also, data-driven and want to know the answer to that question.
How would you say the rollout differs? Because, there's this, depending on where you live, and then what you do for a living,
Hmm.
there's this order, like almost like taking a number or
Hmm.
signing up to take the vaccine. Can you
Yeah.
describe like how exactly this is different than just going to your pharmacy, going to Walgreens, CVS to, get your flu shot? But for this, there's an order, you have to wait. Can you like unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, there was discussion starting back as early as May, when the vaccines were being planned and developed, about who should get the vaccine first. And the reason for that is that the supply and the demand, we knew, were going to be mismatched. So every year when you get your flu vaccine, back in the springtime, we look at what flu is developing in other parts of the world, and we say, okay, we're going to make a flu vaccine. You make it, and you make enough doses at one time so everybody can get a flu shot at one time. This is different because we knew the supply of the vaccine was going to be limited in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is really one of a variety of different perspectives. And the ethicists began to meet in different parts of the world. Indeed, multiple groups met here in the United States to discuss this question. Who should be first? If you have a limited amount of vaccine, who do you put to the front of the line? And several principles came out of that conversation that led to the development of these prioritizations as well. Let me walk through a few of those. One is, and the reason that our employees were in phase 1A is, the people who take care of others need to be present. If we're sick with COVID and can't care for others, there's a multiplier in the wrong direction on that. So by protecting our employees, our healthcare employees, that helps us continue our mission to take care of others. The next step was really, I think, maybe a little bit more controversial, and it had to do with, do you prevent the spread of COVID throughout a community? Do you protect individuals who are the most vulnerable? And these really have competing ethical conversations, and neither one is actually right or wrong. And so what ended up happening was the advisory committee that advises the CDC, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, made a recommendation on that list of prioritization, which was based upon earlier ethical conversations that had occurred all the way through the summer. So it was a very thoughtful process from an ethical standpoint. What happened next was really the federal government said to each of the states, go make your own rules. Here's some recommendations. But the governors and each executive branch of each of the states had the opportunity to flex those rules a little bit. And I think that's where some of the confusion really came into the discussion, is not about, this ethical dilemma, really, this question, do you protect people and prevent spread, or do you protect the most vulnerable? I think most of the states have really followed the CDC recommendation to protect vulnerable individuals in this phase 1A, 1B setting. So it's really challenging when you have this limited supply and demand. In the United States, we're not faced with that very often. In many countries, healthcare resources have to be rationed. There have to be really hard decisions made about who gets what treatment, whether this person can have surgery, whether they have to wait. We hear these discussions from other countries, but we really don't face that on a regular basis here in the U.S. So I think that's why it was lifted up really as I can't have it today when I want it today because we live in the United States and we're used to being able to order something on Amazon and it comes to the front porch. I think, I wouldn't say we're spoiled here in the U.S., but it certainly heightened the conversation in a way that I think we can all appreciate. If you want something, you want it yesterday. But when there's limited supply, that's really how we got to this point. Yeah. All in all, I can say this. I know there's been a lot of discussion around the execution on getting doses of vaccines out. I'm encouraged with where we are right now. The pace is picking up. We're getting the wheels turning on the machines that can give more shots to more people, and I think we're in pretty good shape. The promise of 20 million vaccines before the end of the year, I think, was a little bit ambitious. And at the end of the day, that we got one vaccine in one arm in less than 1 year from the sequencing of this virus, it's a moonshot. It's like, to me, it's like putting a man on the moon. We said we were going to do it. It took roughly a decade, which was amazing. To get a vaccine made that works, that's safe, in less than 1 year, I think is an amazing accomplishment. And I would just say, I hope we can just take a big, deep breath at some point in time and acknowledge that and say, when it's my turn, I'll be in line, and there will be plenty of doses by early summer for everybody in the U.S.
Oh, really? I was going to say, when do
Absolutely.
you think, a larger percentage of the population will have access? And you're saying summertime.
Absolutely. I think certainly by the 4th of July, probably before that, everybody who wants to take a vaccine will have a dose available for them. It's both Moderna, Pfizer, and more recently, if AstraZeneca is approved, we'll have more than 300 million doses in the U.S.
So once vaccinated, can the person just walk around with their mask off? Is there no more social distancing? It's all of a sudden, it's like, I'm totally immune. I can walk around, I can interact however I want, I can go wherever, interact with whomever, so what is like...
Oh, what a dream. What a dream. Eventually, yes. So when enough people in the population have their vaccine, we're going to get to where you were talking about. And you know, praise be the day that that happens. We're going to get there. But we're not going to be able to do that in the beginning. And let me explain the why behind that, because I think you may have heard the recommendation will be people still need to distance, wear a mask, do the things that we've been talking about for the last year. But here are some kind of factoids or little facts that I think your listeners and your viewers can take away. I mentioned earlier the vaccine is 95% effective. It's not 100%. It's 95%. That means 1 in 20 people may still get an infection compared to somebody who didn't have the vaccine at all. So you can still get infection after you take the vaccine, but to prevent you getting it yourself, or a mild case yourself and giving it to somebody else, you still need to be masked up. So we wear masks and we distance not just for ourselves, we do it for our friends, our colleagues, our family, the person at the grocery store that we don't know. I mean, we do this because we care about others. That's what masks and vaccines are really about. Yeah. The second thing I'd like to point out is that we will begin to know that vaccines have taken hold when the case counts are going down and the percent of positive tests in our community goes down. There's going to be a lot of signs as we approach this larger, beautiful day when we can all take our masks off and be closer to each other and go back a little bit. So I know that's disappointing for many people, but I want to come back to this. We need to continue to do those things, not really necessary for ourselves, but for the others who are around us. I mean, it is an act of love to wear a mask and stay apart. And, as much as you want to hug somebody, it's tough, but it's not about I or me. It becomes about us and we. And again, in the United States, sometimes we have a hard time thinking that way, right? It's like I was saying before with the Amazon, I want something on the front porch tomorrow. This is something we're really in for the long haul, but fortunately the long haul is not going to be that long now.
And when will the pandemic label, when can that officially be removed? Once we have more people vaccinated and once we see case numbers and positivity rates declining, when can we say okay, folks, maybe don't take off your mask, but we're no longer under a pandemic?
Yeah, so let me say this. I think it's going to be not quite crystal clear. There's not a number or a fact where we're going to get to a point we're going to say, hoorah, we're done. It's not a date on a calendar. Yeah. The reason I say that, it's going to be different in every community. Mm. So if you look today, you may have seen this when you go surfing the web or watching the news, you may see these maps, these color-coded maps of all the different states. And they're all different colors right now. And we've had states that were, bright red that are now not bright red. And so it's not as simple as saying that this thing is done. It's not going to be like you flip a switch and turn it off. There's still going to be little hot spots around. It's going to be about the community that you're in and the circles that you keep within that community. And every person is going to have to define for themselves when is the pandemic over. And it depends, again, upon that community. It'll be different in Orlando than it is in St. Louis, that it is in Wisconsin. I mean, there are places in Wisconsin now that have very low case counts in the middle of the worst pandemic this country has ever seen. Oh. So it's going to be a local decision, and I don't want that to sound trite, but I do think we're going to know when it approaches our community, again, when our hospitals are not full in the ICU, when case counts go down, and when the positive test rate goes down, we're going to know it.
And speaking about different communities, what type of message would you say is needed for communities who hold trauma from times, and I'm thinking specifically of minority communities, Black communities, where there has been a history of medical experimentation or just a great mistrust of vaccinations, period. And now, thinking that this vaccine came out too fast, all these
Yeah.
like preconceived notions coupled with trauma. What type of messaging and from whom, should it come from?
Well, before I answer your question, let me just point out something that I find just absolutely positive about this. We're having the conversation. For so many years, these traumas have been buried and they were not open for discussion, and people didn't feel comfortable about putting them out and really having the dialogue about what's happened in the past. And the alignment of Black Lives Matter with this pandemic, I think, really helped us get to that point as a nation, hopefully. But even in our smaller communities, these are not things that have been spoken about freely and openly in the past. And I actually celebrate that. I think that's something that's incredibly important to take out of this, is that now there's a dialogue about all those factors and all the bad things that have happened previously. And I celebrate with the Black Lives Matter movement and with all persons of color who bring that dialogue with them. Put it out in the open. Let's talk about what does that history mean and how we can overcome that. And, I'm probably not going to be the voice that will change a mind on that. But if we can encourage that conversation, a rich conversation within all communities, I think we're going to move that forward. And suffice it to say, there will need to be a lot more conversation than what we've had so far. And, I think it's silly. Some people stand up and say, trust me, I say it's safe. That's not enough.
Right.
It's a dialogue. It's really about a community having information, understanding the past, and answering the questions both independently and as a community. I do want to go back, and I've said it once before, and I'll say it again in this arena. There is also this question of why. Why would a person want to take a vaccine? With all of that history, why? And every person has to answer that question. I've answered it for myself. I believe that this is helpful for others, not just for myself. I believe that this is the pathway for us as a community to get out of this pandemic. And I care enough to want to, visit with my family and get close and, do the things that we've done historically. And this, for me, these are the reasons that I feel compelled. And I would say all communities have to answer this question. It's not just Black or Latinx or Asian. This is a question that all communities have to answer. Why would I want to take the vaccine beyond what it does for me? And that's a different dialogue that I think we'll get to in the coming months, particularly as we acknowledge the past and do everything that we can to try to prevent the disparities that have been created historically.
Yeah, especially when they have deep roots. You're right. It won't take one person. It won't take just one conversation. It has to be um, intentional dialogue and intentional listening to understand those traumas.
Mhm.
Can you also talk about this variant strand of COVID-19 and the how the vaccines fare against it? Are the vaccines effective?
Yeah.
Can you discuss that?
Yeah. So these strains, there's a South African strain, there's the UK strain, there are a few others. There was one identified last summer, the 614 variant. And what we know from the science at this point, and it's not deep and strong science, but it's compelling, is that these little changes that occur in the virus over time they accumulate and they actually make it easier to pass the coronavirus from one person to the next. It doesn't look like right now that the case of COVID that somebody gets is any worse that leads to more hospitalizations. That doesn't appear to be the case. That may be in part accounting for the rise in cases that we're seeing this winter, which is 5 times higher than we saw in March of last year, which we thought was a surge.
Yeah.
So just so we understand what these strains actually mean, it's about ease of transmission from one person to the other. Much easier transmission. With regards to the vaccines, there've been a few reports in the last week or two to suggest that the vaccines are still going to be active against these strains. I personally, based on the science, don't believe there's going to be any concern with the vaccines. And the reason I say that is the human body has a rich and varied response to the vaccine. It doesn't just make one kind of antibody. It makes thousands of different antibodies against multiple parts of this particular virus. And that really is different than some other treatments like we've heard about monoclonal antibodies, where there is real concern about whether they're going to be active or not. But with the vaccine, the way they're built and designed, I don't really have any concerns about whether the vaccine is going to be active against the strains that we've seen thus far.
And when you say it's much easier to pass along, are there extra precautions that we should be taking in addition to, the mask and the 6 feet? What else? What else
No,
do we do?
no, just do those things, and you're going to be just fine. I think that's it's coming back to that core message. I'll give you an example. We've heard about these super spreader events where one person in a crowd can give it to many people. These strains are more likely, based upon some modeling and work that we've seen, to be spread very quickly throughout these super spreader events. So small groups are going to continue to be important. Masking, distancing, all the same things apply. So fortunately, we do have the tools in the toolkit to break the strains. It's called the vaccine, and all the things like masks and distancing. And this can be controlled. So, in the beginning, there was a lot of worry about this being, a super, killer bug and that sort of thing. It's not proven to be the case in 6 weeks or so since we've understood more about this strain.
Yeah. And one more point about the vaccine before we start to wind down a bit. What are some of the common side effects of the 2 vaccines? And how do they differ, if they do differ, from other vaccines?
Yeah, so I'm hopeful that your listeners and those watching have had their flu vaccine recently. And we know that people vary in how they respond to a vaccine. And when I was younger, I used to get my flu vaccine on a Friday so I could hang out over the weekend and not have to work, because I felt bad. I had, and it's very similar with this vaccine as well. Fatigue, headache, arm is sore, doing this sort of thing. There are a few people that will have fever and chills. That's not common, but it happens. And those are the main ones. I think the fatigue and the headache, some people say they feel like they're getting the flu. Just to be very clear, these are not viruses these vaccines are not viruses that you can transmit or get infected with. That's just, it's not how they work. But it does feel like you may be coming down with a little something. The good news is they're time limited. They last a day or 2. People recover from them very quickly. We recommend taking Tylenol or something like ibuprofen for people who have a little fever or sore arm or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, I think there was this perception early on about tolerability of these vaccines, and I think now that they've been out and about, it's not as big of a concern as one would have thought, based upon the news reports that we saw early on.
Yeah.
And that's something that we're seeing.
Yeah, there's like a bit of sensationalism sometimes when people really focus on the anomalies, I would say, and that tends to fan the flames of people who don't want to trust. They'll hear of one specific case without knowing specifics surrounding that one case, but solely contributing
Yeah,
it to the vaccine. And I think that's harmful and reckless.
it is. It's unfortunately, and I would agree with that. The one thing that I would urge is that by now somebody probably knows somebody who's had a vaccine. Talk to them. You can go look up the data on the FDA webpage. Probably not going to do that, but go talk to somebody who's had the vaccine and get their experiences. And if you talk to enough people, you'll understand it. It may produce a little bit more, maybe just a slight bit more symptoms than what you would expect with the flu vaccine. But as it goes, you have a choice. You can either get COVID or you can have a sore arm and maybe be tired for a couple of days. For me, it was a pretty easy decision, not only for myself, but
That
as I said
seems
before,
pretty easy.
the people around me. And there's a very, very small number of people that will have more severe reactions. I think everybody may have seen the news reports about the reactions that occurred in the United Kingdom with those first couple of doses. We now have data to show that kind of severe reaction occurs with a very low frequency, 1 in 100,000. Okay, it's a very small number of people. And by and large, these are people who carry EpiPens with them already and have a history of allergies. And those people need to speak with their doctor and be in a special setting if they're going to choose to take the vaccine. So we've learned a lot in the last couple of months or less.
Yeah.
And what we've learned has actually increased our confidence in the safety of these two vaccines rather than decreased. And so we had those first two cases in the UK. Now we have this big reporting system that tells us it's about 1 in 100,000. Okay. And nobody's died. They get a shot of Benadryl and some epinephrine and everybody recovers. And so, that's about giving a vaccine in a safe location with people who are trained. If you have a history of allergy, you need to be in a special place. You need to be at a hospital, not in a parking lot, if you understand, right? So, and I think most people understand that if they have that condition.
What will you say our normal will look like post-pandemic?
I am very hopeful that that we will have learned many things from the pandemic that will make life after the pandemic just pretty amazing. I think if we slow down and recognize what we've missed during the pandemic, it's really been about the collegiality, friendships, connections, the community environment, prayer groups, you name it, whatever that smaller environment is where we really connect with others. I think many of us long for that. I mean, that's a real big miss. And it's been tough, particularly on my mother, other older people who have to, to protect themselves have had to really not necessarily isolate, but just reduce the number of interactions.
Yeah.
That makes the world go round. That's, it's one of the richest and most wonderful parts of our life. And I think there'll be a big appreciation for those kinds of community interactions and just reconnecting with people. I see it as being extremely positive because sometimes you don't really know what you're missing until you miss it. So it's going to be a fantastic, beautiful thing. That's my prediction for the future, and I hope people see this as being, kind of a real test of our, connection, our faith, our community, And I'm really looking forward to getting out of this. I know everybody else is, but it's going to be bigger than I think most people predict.
Wow. Thank you so much for that perspective. Is there anything else you would like to add? Something that we may not have covered about this that you think people should know, or even, you already just gave us a great message. But
Well, I think I would just leave with that word. I think
yeah,
that is the word of the next 6 months is hope, a little bit of patience. You know, as we talked about before, it's easy to gravitate towards why didn't we give 20 million shots? We gave a lot of shots. We're doing a lot better than we were. It's a remarkable scientific achievement, but the human involvement here in the next 6 months is going to be so very important. And I'm hopeful that certainly by the summer, if not early in the fall, we're going to be out of this pandemic.
I'm really looking forward to that. And even before that, I'm really looking forward to an opportunity to get the vaccine. I can't wait.
I can't wait. That's a great attitude to have. And maybe we can get back together after that and talk about other things other than the pandemic. There's so much wonderful, groundbreaking science that's going on these days in other areas. And we're in a new era of scientific discovery and application, and I'm very hopeful about that too.
Me too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of NewsPoints on the Air. NewsPoints on the Air is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Milan Medley. Executive producers are Dan Weber, Julio Munoz, and Kimberly Moran. Graphics are by Jonathan LaPointe. Listen and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Share with your family and friends. Give us a 5-star rating. I said 5, nothing less, and write a review. Also, be sure to subscribe to NewsPoints. That's our weekly digital newsletter with news stories, special announcements, and ministry resources. Go to nadadventist.org, then click on news. If you have any questions for me, send them to ontheair@nadadventist.org. That's ontheair@nadadventist.org. That's all for this week. We'll see you next time.